On behalf of the Caribbean Tourism Organization and the Caribbean Hotel and Tourism Association, I'd like to thank all of you who are participating in today's webinar, Brexit and Caribbean Tourism, Possible Implications. There has been a tremendous amount of speculation regarding the extent of impact which the Brexit decision will have on the global economy, trade, currency rates, travel, and political stability. One thing that is certain is the uncertainty of all of this. Another certainty which was brought out yesterday by CTO's chairman, Minister Sealy, during a press conference is that of resiliency. He pointed out that the region is no stranger to external challenges and weathering them, and that Brexit will prove to be no exception. Needless to say, though, it is a challenge. While this has certainly historically been the case in terms of our resiliency, how well we weather the next storm really depends upon how well prepared we are to control that which we can control and to adapt to that which we have little control. Today, we are fortunate to have two excellent resource persons with us to speak to both the immediate implications of Brexit as well as to those possible long-term considerations, all with the view as to how we as tourism stakeholders in the region can plan, adapt, and adjust accordingly, and how we might even turn some negatives into positives. Adriana had mentioned that you can submit questions. You can submit those at any time. So during the course of any of the presentations, feel free to just type in your questions or even comments for response, and we'll catalog those and be able to hopefully get to as many, if not all, as possible at the end. Allow me to introduce both of our presenters. David Jessup is no stranger to the Caribbean. In a previous life, he was Executive Director for the Caribbean Council, which is now headed up by Chris Bennett. David is a consultant to the Caribbean Council and has worked on Caribbean issues for over 40 years. He provides high-level support and advice to industries, associations, governments, and companies on investment, trade policy, and political issues in the Caribbean, the UK, and continental Europe. He has a weekly syndicated column which basically reaches many of the Caribbean's newspapers and writes a business of tourism column in the Jamaica Gleaner. His most recent column addressed the whole issue of Brexit. He's been on top of that, I would imagine, for some time now, but his most recent column on Brexit was yesterday. It was what happens next after Brexit, what happens next for the Caribbean. Also joining us today is Mark Tanzer. Mark is the CEO for the Association of British Travel Agents. His members are critical to our success with the UK market, helping to channel much of our UK business. Mark has been Chief Executive of ABTA since September of 2005. He is responsible for the strategy and direction of the association. Before joining ABTA, Mark held senior strategy and corporate finance positions in a number of industry sectors and was a group strategy director of Centrica, the parent company of British Gas and the Automobile Association. ABTA is the UK's largest travel association representing travel agents and tour operators that sell £32 billion of holidays and other travel arrangements each year. So we're going to start with David, who will give kind of a big picture view on what's going on and what the possibilities might be, and then we'll go on to Mark to speak specific to the tourism industry. David.
Frank, thanks very much. What I want to do this afternoon, or this morning your time, is talk a little bit in general terms about the implications and the process of Brexit, and then look at one or two specific issues from a Caribbean tourism perspective. I think, as everybody of course will be aware, that on June 23, by a small majority, the British people voted to leave the European Union. But what happens next is really far from clear. This is because only when a new British Prime Minister is appointed in September will a formal period of reflection begin on the future options for the UK's relationship with what will become the EU 27 member states. Then at some time after that, possibly at the year's end, will the UK decide to invoke the relevant article of the European Treaty to leave the European Union, and then effectively embark on an uncertain two-year process of negotiation. The fact is that process is going to be far from easy. It will require high-level national leadership in the United Kingdom in both of the main UK political parties. It will also require the civil service to develop objective options and to negotiate. And possibly, and this is something that people haven't really thought about a lot, possibly up to 10 years to unravel EU regulations and laws, with extraordinary additional complications arising if Scotland were to seek independence based on its desire to leave the European Union. What this therefore means is that it's possible to envisage a long period of economic and political uncertainty, a possible recession in the United Kingdom, the diminution in the short to medium term of the British economy in terms of its size and reach, and of course the continuing weakness of sterling. Moreover, there's now widespread concern that the vote in the United Kingdom could actually play to the political and economic tensions within the EU 27, and there is a view in some parts of Europe that that could mortally weaken the already shaky foundations of European unity. So it's not a good overall picture, but something that I don't think has been necessarily fully understood in the Caribbean region is that nothing structural in the region's relationship with either the UK or a Europe of 27 member states will happen suddenly. And that potentially offers the tourism industry in the region some space in which to think about where it wants to go. And moreover, the Caribbean's relationship with the EU 27, that's all the other member states, on trade through the Economic Partnership Agreement, and sums that are already programmed for development support, plus all else will continue unchanged far into the future. So as I suggested, I think this gives the region some breathing space in which to study the impact and the future relationship that the region wants with Europe. And in general terms, also perhaps, and this is more of a political point, to determine how much future weight it wishes to place on the UK and the EU 27 relationship vis-à-vis North America and other newer partners in the world. But that said, I mean, it seems to me when I was looking at some of the issues for tourism, that the tourism industry doesn't actually have the same luxury to sort of wait and undertake some of this analysis. Because tourism, unlike any other industry in the region, is uniquely exposed to the short and medium-term economic effects of Brexit. And that's because the industry depends on consumer and investor confidence in its principal feeder markets, the currencies of visitors retaining purchasing power, the predictability of regulation and investor certainty. So I did a quick analysis, and I mean these are very early thoughts, of course, but I can see a number of ways in which the region's industry might be affected. Firstly, and perhaps this is the most obvious, the collapse in the value of sterling to the US dollar rate, and by extension its decline in relation to all dollar-related currencies in the Caribbean, is likely to last for some years. I mean, while no doubt sterling will in due course settle, it's interesting to note that in the last couple of days some financial analysts have been suggesting that it will settle at around about US $1.25 to the pound sterling. And that seems to suggest that the present weakness of sterling suggests that the short-term outlook for most destinations, particularly for mid-market and family vacations in the Caribbean, will remain uncertain perhaps for a while, and the low season weaker. Secondly, there will be a negative effect on trade flows. UK will have to make up its mind what trade relationship it wants with the EU and with the rest of the world. And each of the three main options that it has with Europe all involve in due course a future Caribbean trade negotiation with the UK. While in the shorter term, it's possible to see that the weakness of sterling will offer the opportunity to make purchases from the UK more cheaply, the trading goods and services relationship with the UK will eventually depend on what type of trade deal the Caribbean and UK want, and whether that is similar to the to the Economic Partnership Agreement. Thirdly, and I think this is an issue of some significance for the industry going forward, questions arise in relation to future development assistance. The industry and some governments have been making quite significant progress with UK support in having the EU recognised the importance of tourism and providing it with development support. But when the UK departs the European Development Fund, it will lose the UK contribution, which is currently about 15% of the total of 500 million euros each year. How the UK decides its bilateral development priorities outside of the EU remains to be seen. And I do wonder how that will actually work, given that Prime Minister Cameron recently promised a significant amount to the region in terms of grant assistance. Fourthly, and this is not an issue I'm an expert on, and it will be perhaps something that Mark might talk to, there's likely to be a wide range of regulatory issues that will arise. There's everything from standards to consumer legislation, open skies agreements, and environmental issues, which have been agreed at an all-EU level, will have to be looked at again in the context of the future relationship. And while it's quite possible that much will remain the same, it's clear that with the UK's now limited negotiating capacity, the Caribbean is not perhaps going to be a priority. Fifthly, and this is a completely different subject, but I think it's worth mentioning, is that a range of quite difficult issues will arise for the UK overseas territories in the region, which will rapidly need to find new and unified ways to relate to the EU 27. They're going to have some particularly challenging issues in relation to EU funding, freedom of movement, their role as offshore centres, and many other technical issues. And sixthly, more generally, the region will no longer have Britain's voice in support of its interests in the Council of Europe, suggesting a much closer relationship, perhaps with France, Spain, or the Netherlands, might be required. As I said at the outset, it's still very early days to try and analyse these issues. But I think there perhaps are 2 or 3 steps that the tourism industry could perhaps begin to start thinking about. And let me just close with these observations. The first is to undertake a detailed assessment of how much the UK market matters and to study the likely issues that will arise out of having eventually parallel trade and regulatory environments with the UK and with the EU 27. A second is really getting to know the individuals involved. That's to say, develop a relationship on a sustained basis with those who will be politically and administratively responsible for negotiating the UK's exit and its future relationship with the rest of the world. And exactly the same holds true of the European Commission and in key EU 27 member states. The third is something the Caribbean is doing already, but to continue the process of market and airlift diversification in countries that rely heavily on UK visitors. And my fourth and final point is that it seems to me to be absolutely vital in this process that tourism boards, the industry and governments work together to try to determine how they respond. So let me stop there. I hope I've kept your timetable.
That's very good. Thank you, David. It was a great comprehensive overview of matters as we know them. Mark, to you.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody from London. Well, I think David's given a very good sort of overview of where we are politically and some of the big issues. Perhaps if I can just talk about the travel aspects that we've been engaged in here. ABTA, as Frank said, we're the biggest travel association in the UK, and unusually for a trade association, we also are very much seen as the sort of consumer ombudsman, the consumer's spokes champion in terms of travel. And obviously we're very engaged in politics and policy in Westminster, in London, and also in Brussels. So in the run-up to the referendum, we published our own research on what leaving the EU would mean for the travel industry and also for the travelling public. And we did that really to give people some information from experts about what the impact would be on this part of their life that is to do with them as travellers. So we weren't trying to tell people to vote in or out. We were just saying, insofar as you're thinking about how this will affect you as a person who travels, this is our view. And the view was that there was a lot more to lose than to gain from leaving the EU. I have to say that when we put the report together, and the consensus to my own view was that I hope we wouldn't ever have to use it. But we are now in the position of being able to sort of go back to our own report and find out exactly what we've got to do. The most immediate impact we foresaw, and which has happened, was, as David said, the impact on the pound. Consumers understand that. It's a very immediate effect. If you're spending more for your glass of beer or your cup of coffee or your hotel bill, you don't have to be a very sophisticated economist to understand that. And we did predict that a leave vote would have, certainly in the short term, a damaging effect on the pound, and that's exactly what we've seen. And it's 130 against the dollar at the moment, and I don't know what against the euro, but it's very significantly down, 117 or something, I think, when I last looked. So that has a big impact in the short term, not just because of the financial costs, but just the consumer uncertainty. And certainly what we saw here in the immediate day after and week following the referendum result was a slowing down in bookings for this summer. Naturally, people have taken fright. They don't like uncertainty, and in that situation, consumer spending is always kind of slowed down. And we'll see what happens to the pound, but that is certainly a short-term impact. When we also looked at what would happen if we left, what needs to be maintained, there are some freedoms that we currently enjoy, particularly to and from the European countries, that we have to preserve, and probably the most important is our access to the European Common Aviation Area. We have European open skies, as I'm sure many of you know. We can fly to anywhere we like in Europe from point to point, and we can fly to any place we like in the United States through their open skies arrangement with the European Union. And that is important. That has really allowed, in the UK, the introduction of the low-cost airlines, which have become such a feature of the market here. And consumers have got very used to having relatively cheap flights to a very large number of destinations. And if we're not in the EU, the question is, how do we preserve access? Countries in Europe have historically been quite protective over their airspace, favouring their national carriers, and we don't want to go back to an era where we are excluded or priced out of certain destinations. And similarly, freedoms for people. We want people to be able to travel freely without visas, to go from country to country without going through multiple border controls or visa requirements. And also, I have to say, for the travel industry and the hospitality industry, it's very important that we do have mobility of labour. That is a very hot topic. As those of you who have followed the referendum will know, the movement of people and the free border access has been one of the main issues. But it's very clear that our industry needs to have that flexibility, but partly because of the seasonality. We need to be able to bring people in at short notice if the bookings are up, and then let them go again, have very laborious, work permit processes. So there are those freedoms that are now, if not in jeopardy, certainly they have to be negotiated and agreed in the discussions going forward with the EU. And then, as David also said, there is a bunch of regulations that are currently part of the travel industry that wherever you're flying. So, for instance, we have the package travel regulations here, which come from a European directive, which say that if you sell a package holiday, it has to be protected. In the event that you go bust, people can be brought home or given a refund. And that is transposed into UK law and is currently in the process of being revised at the European level. They've agreed a new directive which extends those protections to sort of online purchases of flight plus accommodation. So we immediately have a question that these are on the UK statute books. They don't fall away immediately, but we have to decide, do we keep them as they are? Do we extend them? What is the consumer utility and industry utility of those? There's another bunch of regulations that are to do with air passenger rights, particularly around compensation for delays. These are regulations in Europe, so they're not in UK law, so they would fall away if we left the EU, and we would have to decide whether we wanted to mirror those within UK law or have a different set of compensation regime or have no compensation at all. And then there are some very specific benefits, particularly in the European context, that British citizens enjoy. So at the moment, if you're in the EU, you have access to free medical care. You have roaming charges on your mobile phone are to be abolished, and so forth. So there's some real tangible consumer wins that have been gained at the European level that we wouldn't want to lose. So really all of those are now having to be worn back, if I can put it like that, or the decision made as to whether we maintain them or not. So what we did really the day after the referendum and what we're doing going forward is, first of all, give out very reassuring messages to the general public that, as I think Frank said, nothing is changing in the very short term or even in the foreseeable term in terms of the structures and the regulations, and that if you've got a holiday booked, you can still take the holiday, and cash machines will still give you euros against pounds. All of the questions that we get asked, and we get asked a huge number of these questions by the media, and trying to make sure that in what is already a difficult summer here in terms of sort of terrorism and security issues and so forth, with people kind of moving very much from the Eastern Mediterranean to the Western Mediterranean, that we maintain consumer confidence. That's the first thing we do. The second is to be straight into the government here with those priorities about maintaining these sort of freedoms, particularly aviation and freedom to move, so that as they start putting their kind of priorities together for EU negotiation, the travel agenda is right at the top of that. And the third is really to create a very long list of all the different issues, which go down to micro issues such as will you need an international driver's license to go to Europe, which are quite parochial, but they're all questions that we will be asked, and to set up a comprehensive project structure to address all of those. Now, this would be a big enough piece of work even if we had some kind of clarity about the politics and the process going forward. As you'll be aware, the referendum has caused a major upheaval within the parties here, and as David said, until we've got a new leader, or maybe even new leaders of the two parties, it's difficult to have much sensible conversation with the politicians at the moment. But even when that is in place, there are still some very big question marks about when this process of divorce starts. The 2-year window that is triggered when we invoke Article 50 is there to determine the leaving conditions. It is not necessarily there to say that is the time frame for getting all of the new world order conditions in place, which could well take an awful lot longer if my experience of negotiating with Europe is anything. Trying to get agreements on all of these different fronts will take far longer than 2 years. So this could be a prolonged period of stalemate, uncertainty, whatever you want to call it. So I think we have to sort of suck deeply as an industry and wherever we are, and realise it's going to be quite an extended period of fluctuation and uncertainty. Just 2 points I'd make to finish up and then pass back to you are, I don't think it's always understood that people say that, for instance, the arguments here have been, well, of course, Germany will continue to want to sell us their cars, and Europe will continue to want to have open airways because they want to come to the UK, and so on and so forth, as though these are going to be negotiated on an item-by-item or maybe even a bilateral basis. That is not the way the EU works. Germany is not at liberty to negotiate a deal with us about its cars. It can only negotiate through the EU, and therefore, the risk is that even though both sides may want, quite clearly to have open channels for flying, say for aviation, it could be held back because there are disputes about fishing policy, and the EU will say, well, we're not going to give you this until we've got that. And I think it's we will be trying to work on the government here to make sure we don't end up in a very long stalemate, which damages the economies on both sides of the debate. And the last thing I'd say, particularly for the Caribbean, is this isn't just about the UK. I spent a lot of time in Brussels over the last few years and in the run-up to the referendum, and the EU itself has got its own stresses and strains. I think David mentioned the elections that are coming up, but I think there's some big questions being asked more generally about the EU in terms of migration and movement of people and so forth, and of course the Greek bailout is likely to come back to the table at the time of the election. So I think it's very important that not just the Caribbean but other countries don't remain solely focused on what's happening in the UK, but have dialogue with other EU people, EU countries, and with the institutions in Brussels themselves to understand what may be changing, irrespective of the United Kingdom position within the EU. So as I said, I didn't anticipate to be here or having this call, delighted I am to be on it, but we are where we are, and I think it's up to us, the industry, really to take the initiative and really show the politicians where we want to go. That's it.
Thank you, Mark. Very helpful. And by the way, listeners, the ABTA has a consumer travel alert for on their website with some FAQs and Q&As in there, and I think you find it very helpful. Keep in mind you can submit questions and comments. We've got a number that have already come in, and we'll be getting to those shortly. All of this reminds me of the saying in politics that there's basically two things that you never want to see being made. One is sausage, and the other is legislation. And I think we can add a third thing to that right now: the Brexit negotiations as well. This is not going to be pretty, and it's going to take some time and a lot of horse trading. I'll start us off with a couple of questions as well for either of the panelists. What should hoteliers be doing now? I mean, front and center is the currency fluctuations. We're watching it every day and just really mesmerized by what's going on with it. What should hoteliers be doing now with the currency exchange issues? How do they hedge their bets with that, and particularly in cases where they have existing agreements with tour operators and so on? I don't know if, Mark, you want to take a stab at that first, and David, chime in.
Well, I think the problem is really on the other side for the hoteliers. If you've got contracts that are already in place, then the tour operators and the other party will have one of those. I think that the challenge for them is if they have not themselves hedged themselves against this currency movement and suddenly find themselves having to pay a lot more pounds than they'd anticipated to pay for the hotels, and therefore if they've already priced their holidays and sold it, then they could face a very nasty squeeze. And now the most of the big tour operators will have hedging strategies in place, so there won't be a problem. But I think some of the smaller ones maybe won't. If I were a hotelier, I'm not trying to scare them. You just want to make sure that those contracts are properly fulfilled, and that you're talking to the people on the other end to make sure that they're able to do that, and they're not caught in a currency squeeze themselves.
Okay. The only thing.
Go ahead. Go ahead, David.
The only thing I'd add to that is that I suspect that between now and the end of the year, that market volatility in terms of pricing sterling will become greater, because the markets are really uncertain how to address this. Because, as Mark said and I said, is until we have some clarity as to what the policy is on a new relationship, it's very, very difficult to actually determine the relative weight and value of sterling, the dollar, or the euro.
Are we looking at any vulnerability, as we've had in some global economic situations in the past, where tour operators could be finding themselves going out of business, and there's exposure all around?
Well, it's market. Tour operators can always go out of business, Frank, we know that. I mean, that's not just because of currency I mean, we've had an example, this week, one of our members who was focused on Turkey. Clearly, the Turkish market is very heavily down, and they've had to shut up shop. So, I mean, it's there's choppy waters out there, and currency volatility adds to that. That said, certainly from ABTA members' point of view, they've all got strong balance sheets, and they should be able to ride this through. So I don't think there should be any panic. And I think it's also certainly up until the referendum, in spite of all of the sort of geopolitics, the market from the UK was up 5% in volume and value. So the underlying demand is still there. People still want their holidays, and I think even through this uncertainty, what history demonstrated is that people's leisure travel is very high on their list of disposable income spend. They'll put off other capital purchases, a new car, a new couch, a new bed, but they want their annual holiday. So I think, although we're not complacent, I think we're at least lucky that we've got a product where the underlying demand is still very robust.
And we've been seeing some shifting of travel all over Europe away from some of their more comfortable and closer markets, the African Mediterranean, the Red Sea, the Indian Ocean, and so on, Turkey, and so on. We're seeing some shift. We believe we've been seeing some shifting into the Caribbean from that and from the UK. So to your point, Mark, that we can't consider necessarily that the travel market from the UK is dried up. I think there's some validity there, particularly as we're seeing some displacement going on in terms of where people are traveling. What do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I don't know maybe whether the on the webinar are aware, but at the moment people can't travel to Tunisia from the UK. The UK government has put a do not travel alert on Tunisia. The airport to Sharm el-Sheikh, which is a big destination in the Red Sea, is shut because of security reasons there. And the general market in Turkey is down by about 30%. And it's not just the UK, that's from Germany as well. And so what that has meant is that, as I said, there's been a huge move to the Western Mediterranean, to Spain, Portugal, to the Canary Islands, but of course capacity there is getting very tight, and that's opened up people's ideas to go long haul, to go to the Caribbean, the United States, and so forth. So, it's amazing how quickly the consumer pattern shifts in response to these either security or pricing issues, and I think the Caribbean could well be a beneficiary of that, certainly this year and maybe even into the near future.
And David, a question in terms of the regulatory matters, particularly as it relates to air travel and open skies and so on. Indications from the EU representatives, several of them have commented that the UK can't have its cake and eat it. And in that regard, what are the chances of being able to grandfather in some of these key things that are so important to the travel industry, such as the open skies agreements?
I think the issue is very much as Mark did. I've personally been involved with a number of Caribbean industries in trade negotiations, and it becomes very clear rapidly that if you're negotiating with one front, there's nearly always another company or another interest that wants to trade off one against the other. So while in theory, I mean, it would be possible to grandfather in those rights, as you put it, we don't know what the shape of the negotiation is going to be because we don't know which option the government is going to seek, and then we don't know what other EU member states will specifically want. So at the moment, I mean, it's very difficult to give you a clear answer, and that's why I suspect that what the industry should be considering is drawing up a list of questions to begin to consider what they want, and then begin to determine how to prosecute their case with governments in Europe and with the United Kingdom.
Very good. That's some good counsel. We have a question, basically, the question is, clarify short to medium-term implications given the position of the UK as major connecting point for EU travelers to the region. So the short-term to the medium implications regarding, I guess it's regarding connecting travel through the UK from the EU. Any comments on that?
Well, I don't think in the short term, it depends what you mean by short term, I don't think there should be any direct implications. You know, everything, as I said, the structures and the access and the slots and everything remain as is. So I think it's very important that we're out confident messages to the customers going forward. As to what happens in the longer negotiations, it remains to be seen. I mean, logic would say that it's in everybody's interest to keep these trade routes, which is what aviation routes are, as open as possible, whether we're in the or not. And even if we're not part of I expect we'll establish a sensible aviation agreement. One of the casualties short term that has come out of this is, of course, decision about additional runway capacity in the UK and the South East. So this has been going on for years, and we've finally reached a position where, in principle, the need for additional capacity had been accepted, and the government was due to make a decision on where this would be placed this summer. That has now been delayed again, and the danger is that with all of the other business the government has to do on top of its daily work, that this gets pushed back. So part of what we will be doing as ABTA is making sure that we don't get completely absorbed in Brexit, and those domestic requirements are still met. And I think that additional capacity should help everybody, particularly on the long haul interconnectivity, to you know, get more competition into the market.
Yeah, life does go on, doesn't it? Mark, here's a question specifically for you. Explain if it is permissible for tour operators to start repricing or charging supplements to the consumer to protect themselves from currency fluctuations.
We have a surcharge. What do you call them? Supplements or surcharges? We haven't seen that happening here yet. Obviously, you can do it, but there's a kind of customer relations downside, and we have a rule here that if it goes beyond 10%, then you have to give the customer the option to cancel and a refund. So you can't do it sort of to any degree you like. But historically, where there have been fluctuations, you have seen it. It hasn't been in the market here for a long time, so I think if a tour operator starts doing that, they may get some consumer resistance. And of course, it depends on your terms and conditions, what you said in your own terms and conditions, but some tour operators have left themselves the scope to do that. Haven't seen it yet happening in the market here.
David, there seems to be... Go ahead.
No, I think what probably is happening is that tour operators going and talking to the hoteliers and trying to get sort of keener rates to cover their exposure at that end before they go back to customers, is my guess. But the hoteliers would know that better than me.
Right. David, there seems to be some opportunity. I mean, we keep looking at the implications directly on tourism, but also not to forget particularly with the currency fluctuation, the opportunities that may exist with purchasing of goods and services out of the UK. I mean, do you see that as a benefit to our industry? Should we be looking at those options right now?
Yes, I think clearly there are some short-term benefits, but the issue is how much purchasing by the industry is actually undertaken in the United Kingdom. And it also is beholden on exporters to spend more time than usual.
Okay. There was a question specifically for you, David. Given the protracted and extended EU CARIFORUM EPA negotiations, is CARICOM ready to engage in eventual new trade negotiations with a non-EU UK?
Well, I have a fairly robust view on it. One of the things I think, and I would hope that this is something that Caribbean heads of government are considering at the moment, is how you engage with the ABTA when the process begins. One of the issues is, should they engage as CARICOM, should they engage with CARIFORUM, or maybe should they engage CARICOM, CARIFORUM territories, because there are a whole range of issues that will have to be net in terms of negotiations on issues like substantially all trade. I mean, these are quite technical issues. Just to negotiate with a loan is going to raise some interesting technical challenges as well as political challenges in the region.
Okay. Mark, here's a question from my colleague, Hugh Riley. And he's basically asking, has ABTA seen a spike in bookings from the U.S.? Questioning, are Americans who would normally travel to the Caribbean now headed to the U.K. because of price?
No, I haven't got extra data on that yet. I mean, this is only a week old, so I will let you know. Obviously, the UK domestic tourism industry thinks they will get a boost from the decline in the share price, in the currency. So whether that diverts people from the Caribbean, I don't know. I would have thought they were quite different products, to use industry terms. I mean, I think if you were going to the Caribbean, to sort of shift that and come to East Anglia is quite a big change. So I think maybe both sides will win.
That would be the ideal, wouldn't it? Yeah. I'm not quite sure of the question here, but I'm going to throw it out. Just to respect the questionnaire, wouldn't it be helpful to get a UK commitment in the short term to retain service agreements in the region, thus tourism chapters of the EPA? How can this be obtained in, quote, bankable assurance, end quote?
Okay, I think I understand the question. That is a very interesting idea, but the question is finding people to talk to who are in a position to provide a bankable assurance. That there is a lot of language that relates to tourism, indeed in the Cotonou Convention. And one of the things I expect that Canadian politicians and the industry will need to do in London is to develop a close working relationship with the officials and the politicians at the right moment to remind them that the Caribbean is, that these are critical issues in the Caribbean. That the problem is that, to be frank, the Caribbean is not going to be very high on London's list of countries, regions that it wishes to negotiate with. So early intervention and make the Caribbean's case, I think, would be very important.
Very good. The tourism investments, I think, David, you had mentioned earlier about the potential impact on tourism investments, but I also understand that we may see some flight from investments in the UK to elsewhere. Does that present opportunities for the Caribbean?
Possibly. Most of the, and maybe Mark would like to comment on this, but most of the potential flight I see is in the area of financial services at the moment because of the uncertainty. I think the question will arise in terms of investments once it becomes clear how good or bad London's ability to package deals.
It keeps coming back to that, doesn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, I think if you listen to the arguments of the people who are in favour of leaving the EU, one of it is that it will open up all sorts. And although personally I think that's a big bet to make in terms of giving up the EU access for that. Certainly it will help with countries where we now can have direct trade discussions, and I think that will bring investment into those destinations.
A question on the development assistance. David, you had mentioned that 15% of the EU's development assistance, technical assistance and financial assistance to the region is really coming from the UK. Can we expect the remaining 85% being vulnerable because there may be some caution on the EU's part to to continue with some of the programs that are in place or that were being planned?
Well, it's not vulnerable up to about 2020 because a lot of assistance is already programmed. What I'm not clear about, and I don't think anybody has any answers on yet, is how the European Union is going to make up in the European Development Fund the shortfall from the UK contribution. But the other question, which I think is more difficult to answer, is how, in development terms, the United Kingdom will relate to the Caribbean region, because it's already graduated out of development assistance as having too high a per capita income. So a question will be, is the extent to which the United Kingdom sees the Caribbean as an important long-term partner. Now, that could break into different elements. I mean, because of course the UK overseas territories theoretically have a first call on the United Kingdom's side. And it may be the United Kingdom will have to replace first the development assistance to the European Union gives to those territories. Again, these are very important issues that nobody can provide an answer to. I suspect it's going to be somebody down the line before anybody in London is actually going to put their mind to trying to find answers.
Yeah, and I would imagine to your point, the Caribbean is fairly low on the totem pole in trying to get attention to its concerns and issues on this. So all the more reason for a much more unified public-private sector approach to deal with it. The question came in is how the relationship with French and Dutch islands in the Caribbean can would be affected with the with regard to the trade and movement of nationals. An example being Anguilla's relationship with the French and Dutch Saint Martin that would still be members of the EU.
There are going to be some detailed technical issues to do with free movement. That's actually an interesting question which hadn't occurred to me. But it will have to be something that will be resolved. And I think something that would be significant, which I've been looking at from the overseas territories perspective the other way around, is to ask the question, what kind of relationship might Holland through their overseas territories with the Caribbean in the future, and is that going to change? I don't have an answer. I don't think it's an interesting issue.
Okay.
Frank, I dropped off the line, Frank, but I'm back on now. Sorry about that.
Okay. No, it was just basically a question on how the French and Dutch islands in the Caribbean would be affected, particularly regarding the movement of trade and people. And again, it's an unknown. But it is a question that needs to be considered in the mix of all of this. Assuming as we're coming to a close here, and we welcome any final questions. We still open to a few more. But assuming the Caribbean got its act together and was able to collectively and collaboratively work with the UK and the EU on some of the matters of concern to them, do you see some silver lining in this for our region, opportunity that we can really take advantage of and ultimately come out stronger from a tourism perspective as a result of this? I always subscribe to the belief that crisis presents opportunity. Does it exist?
I think the what I was talking about earlier, which is the general kind of fluidity of movement of people going, moving from popular destinations where they've perhaps been for the last few years to new destinations, not so much linked to the Brexit issue, is an opportunity for the Caribbean and other destinations. And I think that's, if I were Minister for Tourism or running a hotel there, that's what I'd be focusing on, is really demonstrating at this time how attractive and competitive it is as a tourist destination. I think, to be honest, I think a prolonged period of uncertainty over Brexit won't really help anybody, just because it does tend to drag people's consumer spending down with it. So I think focusing on the positives, I think I'd just be out there marketing the the real benefits of the destination as it is now, rather than expecting a golden dividend from Brexit.
I would agree with that entirely. I think, as Mark said a short while ago, the people who wanted Brexit believe that the United Kingdom will be a stronger economy in the world. But even, and I have to say I was one of those who voted Remain, but I think we're talking about 10 years away before we see the United Kingdom perhaps begin to be resurgent again. And as I noted in my short remarks, is that an awful lot will also depend on whether Scotland remains a part of the United Kingdom.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's not unlike, in some ways, I'll make a parallel between the lifting of the U.S. embargo with Cuba. We view it as an opportunity, and some people view it as a threat, but I think it's a tremendous opportunity for us to challenge ourselves to get better and more competitive. Further to Mark's point, it's an opportunity for the region to demonstrate how attractive we are, and we have tremendous strengths in terms of our attractiveness, both from an investment and certainly from a traveler point of view. But there's really an opportunity to challenge ourselves just to get better overall as we're faced with these kinds of situations. A couple of final questions. Is the weakness of the sterling having significant impact on real estate investments, timeshares, luxury villa purchasers, etc., in the Caribbean by UK investors in the short term? Could we expect that? I think it's too early to tell, but yeah.
To say the property funds here, I mean, these are funds invested in UK property, have certainly taken a knock, but I think that's more of a kind of view of the overall sort of demand for UK commercial property going forward. I don't know how it will impact people's sort of decision to invest in overseas properties. We'll wait and see.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, you could look at it from the perspective either from finding value of sterling or people want to hedge. So it's too early to say.
Should the Caribbean be marketing itself much more aggressively in the UK, or should we put that emphasis in places like the United States, where we have less vulnerability right now?
Well, personally, I think I'd argue that you should market yourselves here. I think even where there have been sort of shocks previously to the currency or whatever, what's happened to UK tourism to Caribbean, it may have taken a short-term knock and then it comes back. And I think if you take your foot off the marketing here, when that does come back, other people will have filled that gap. It is so intensely competitive here. All the destinations are about busy marketing, and I think if you take a holiday, you might find it quite hard to get back to where you were. So I wouldn't, personally, I would keep up your visibility here.
And I know that rings well with our President Carolyn Trubetskoy as well. What effect do you foresee European travel to the so-called British colonies like the Caymans, Anguilla, BVI, Turks and Caicos on the short term? Will they come out a little bit better than the rest of the Caribbean on this?
I don't think there will really be any difference unless in the medium to long term the United Kingdom changed its policy towards overseas territories at the absolute extreme. There are no people who are on the lead side who would in that deep relationship with Britain's overseas territories in the Caribbean. But I mean, that's hugely speculative. I mean, the other issue is direct airlift, which does exist, of course, to difficulties.
And we have two final questions here. It's been well engaging. I really appreciate all the comments and questions from the audience. Does Brexit provide opportunity for closer UK Commonwealth trade relations? And the second part of that, what are implications now for the future of ACP-EU relations? David?
Okay, does it, on the Commonwealth issue, I mean, there are a significant number of people in the Leave campaign, politicians, who believe it would be important to deepen relationships with Commonwealth countries, but to a significant extent that will depend on the free trade negotiation or the free trade agreement they reach with Europe, and then subsequently to which other Commonwealth nations, particularly bigger Commonwealth nations, want a special relationship with the United Kingdom. On the ACP issue, it's a very complex issue, but without putting voice in Europe, in the context of a new agreement with the ACP, it is likely that EU member states that have no relationship with the ACP, voices will be louder and perhaps of late.
Okay. And finally, question is, and I'm not sure if either the three of us are best to answer it, but we'll throw it out there. Are there any special implications for business hotels, hotels which cater primarily to the business market in the Caribbean?
Well, I suppose they could be trying to attract British exporters if they can sell it to people. But I think that's a different answer, and I don't think there's any particular advice that I would give unless that's something.
Okay. Any final comments, Mark, David?
No, just to say that this is a slow burn, and it's necessary to be prepared.
Absolutely, Mark.
Yeah, no, I'd echo that. I think, well, if there's anything that ABTA can do, we are very much the sort of voice of our end of the industry here to government. So if there are particular kind of perspectives you want to fold into that, then let us know, and we'll add them into the debate going forward.
Thank you so much, both of you. You've been incredibly helpful. It's all about managing uncertainty, and there are opportunities to do that. We just one just needs to be aware of what's going on and plan effectively as they can. I'm going to turn it back over to Adriana for some final comments. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, gentlemen, for the wonderful information and for your time. We genuinely appreciate it. I just wanted to wrap things up, letting everyone know that you can access the recording of this webinar on our website, which again is www.caribbeanhotelandtourism.com. And of course, you can follow us on all of our social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. We're going to put links to that webinar on all of that, and any further webinars, which we try to keep you up to date as possible on all of the things that are current events that affect our industry and our region. All of that information can be available on our site as well as on all our social platforms, so please follow us on all of them. Thank you again for your time, gentlemen. Thank you once again, and everybody have a wonderful day.